Boardroom Bound, episode 186, Realizing the Theology of Work in Your Board Role, with Will Messenger.
Now, the thing is, it's not like a job where there's always an opening, right? A company's only looking for a board member once in a while. So that's why it wasn't so much that I networked to find new contacts. It's just that eventually one of the people I contacted, called me and said, hey, actually our board is looking for a couple new board members.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder that you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's show, we'll be speaking with Will Messenger, who is a member of the board of directors of ArQule, a Boston area biotech company focused on cancer drug discovery and development. Will chairs the Compensation, Nominating, and Governance Committee and is also a member of the Audit Committee. He's also the executive director of the Theology of Work project, which conducts research on the intersection of faith and spirituality with the core activities of the business enterprise. He formerly served at McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, IBM, and Advanced Metabolic Systems. In today's show, we'll be exploring a number of interesting topics using Will's experience to land his board seat as a case study. We're going to hear how Will started out when he first realized he wanted to do this, to think through what were his area of expertise, his core skill set, from being someone who worked in biotech, so he'd focus on that industry, who was a strategy consultant from before working at McKinsey, to being an ethics professor, thinking all of that together was a great package, learning how hard that was to actually make that into a package that was successful in generating interest from companies, how he went through his networking opportunities from meeting with people he knew were on boards or new people who were on boards who could make introductions for him. The feedback he got, how he had to pivot his career in search, and then how he was ultimately successful in finding several companies who were interested in him, but then had to stay on their radar until an opportunity came up. I can't wait to share this case study with you today. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about board director education and certification. Want to join your first board or looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Education and Certification course. Get both the modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated with one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency designation upon course completion, available in one-on-one, group, or on-demand registration options. You can learn more at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/IBDC-D. So bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now, let's jump into the show. Will Messenger, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Alexander.
Well, I am excited to use you, if you don't mind, as a case study for our audience, because I love your personal story about, I'm going to call it a little bit of scrap, a little bit of tenacity that allowed you to launch your career. And I love the story about how you landed a board role. So I'm excited to share that with our audience today. And I know we talked about before we went online that you're very happy to be open about the struggles that you went through yourself.
Be glad to.
So perhaps for a bit of history for our audience, maybe you can talk about the time when you thought this is something that I would like to do and the build up to it, just so we have a little bit of context.
Yeah, I guess this was in the early 2000s. And so I'd been an executive in a very small biotech, privately held biotech company. So I had some experience in biotech. But at that time, I was working on my own as a consultant. And I remember one of the things, a problem with being an on-your-own consultant is, when you've got a client, they need you 7 days a week, and there's no time to do marketing. And when you don't have a client, you're not getting any income, and so you can't do marketing either. Really.
Feast or famine.
And so I remember thinking the part I like about consulting the most, I was doing strategic and marketing consulting, mostly in biotech, biomedical. in the biotech biomedical field. And I thought what I really need is a kind of job that is the strategic and forward-looking, kind of putting it all together process. That's what I'm good at and what I enjoy actually. But that comes with a more manageable schedule, and also something where you actually are part of building a company. So the downside of consulting, I think, is you work with a company for a while, could even be a long while, but in the end, you're just a consultant. You're not part of really building anything.
Well, from your days at McKinsey, what you probably were doing was building these amazing strategy documents, giving them the binder and walking away for them to implement them, right? So you never saw it through.
Yeah, that's right. It's not like nothing ever happens. And I'm kind of proud of some of the work I did at those clients, especially my independent clients. But in the end, you do walk away, hopefully with it going well for them. But in any case, you do say goodbye before the fun really starts.
Right.
So it's, partly to be more directly involved, partly for just management of lifestyle. I didn't really want to spend full time doing the consulting because I was beginning to do some teaching at Gordon Conwell, and I wanted to get involved in the other projects, like the Theology of Work project that I'm working on. So it just seemed like a board would be the next great step for me. And that's how I decided, hey, I should see if this can happen.
So basically, you were at a point in your life where you now had the motivation and desire to seek out the board role. And clearly, you had a lot of background and subject matter expertise in the different areas we just talked about, that you were already working in a small biotech, so you knew some of that field. You were building a network and reputation, strong background from McKinsey and some of the other companies that you had worked with at Goldman Sachs, probably very desirable in that regard. So this was all beginning to come together for you, and different perhaps than the way some of the people who listen to the show is. This was partly lifestyle based, right? So that you weren't necessarily thinking of portfolio board companies. You were just targeting one. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And so how did you go about making this search? You're at a transitional point and you're ready to go off and running. What did that actually look like?
Well, I decided I would just I would write or try to meet with anybody I knew who could help me find a board seat. So I didn't have a particular company in mind. I just knew I wanted to be in the biotech space. And by then, I guess I knew maybe 30 or 40 people who were either CEOs in biotech, or anyway, senior executives in biotech, or on a biotech board, or at least some board who might have some connections to biotech boards. And I knew them from the consulting I'd done, going back to McKinsey and my own work, from when I'd been in biotech myself, from some of my teaching. So I actually had some students who had been senior executives in biotech. So I just called them all and wrote to them all. So it was a pretty big campaign, like I say, 30 or 40 people.
It sounds like a lot of coffees.
A lot of coffees, a lot of perfecting the elevator pitch, because basically it's just like pitching a company. Mm-hmm. If you're an entrepreneur, you need that elevator pitch, the 30-second pitch that kind of explains why you could add value to a company. And mine was focused on my experience in human resources. I didn't work in human resources, but my ability to connect with people, and I thought I could be on the compensation committee or human resources committee of a company. And my experience in finance, especially with Goldman Sachs, and finally my experience in biotech. So I had a pitch that had to combine all of those three, and
into 30 seconds.
And the first few times I made it, I decided to make it to people who probably weren't decision makers, who probably couldn't really get me connected to a board, but who would understand what I was trying to do and could give me some good feedback on my pitch. And if it's hard to come up with a pitch with your good idea, it's emotionally hard to pitch yourself in 30 seconds.
Right.
So that was part of the task, actually.
And how did that go? What was the feedback you were getting from people?
The feedback I was getting was not all that positive, honestly, because the main qualification to be on most biotech boards is either you're a retired biotech CEO, or possibly even a sitting biotech CEO, or you're a biotech chief medical officer. Mm-hmm. Or every board needs one financial expert, which often would mean a biotech CFO, although it could be maybe a CFO from any kind of company. And I wasn't any of those things. And so, being strategically very savvy, having a history of helping companies through strategic planning, strategic transitions, which is a lot of what board members do, that actually doesn't hit the sweet spot for biotech board recruiting. And so it was mostly kind of, negative feedback, a pat on the back saying, yeah, you'd be good at this, but I don't see how this adds up to you actually getting a position.
And I don't think that's too dissimilar to other industries. So take financial services, where I spent the majority of my career. Were you a retired executive? Did you do this before? Did you grow up in the industry? And I don't think that's how a whole board should be composed. We talk about diversity now, diversity of thought, diversity of background. And I think this is where this is going to go in your story. But for most people, that is where our mindset is. So you have to overcome that. And I think that's what you're getting to, right? So you had to figure out how do you bridge that gap?
Yes, that's right. And, part of my background was my teaching at Gordon Conwell, and teaching it, what I teach is business ethics. So I thought, that's relevant to a board, right?
Sure. More so than ever before now.
I remember talking to a potential recruiter. In the end, I really couldn't get any of the recruiters excited about me. But I talked to one, and he said, well, business ethics, I mean, you're talking about a religious institution, so that's not quite mainstream, but people can understand it. That would be valuable. Now, are you the dean of the Yale Divinity School? Now, that could be it. I said, no, I wasn't quite at that level. I don't know if I can pitch this, he said. But I decided to keep trying. In the end, you get lots of no's for any kind of job search. So,
that's right. And let's take a quick deviation, just where you are with the recruiters, right? Because that is a common perspective we hear from people of go through the headhunters. They have all the connections. One of our previous episodes, Charles King was the world's leading headhunter. He's placed 600 board members. If you could get on Charles King's radar, that would be great. You were trying to find these people, right? So how did you go about doing that? It sounds like you had a lot of these conversations.
I really only had one recruiter conversation,
okay.
And that was through one of my personal connections who said, "Oh, let me talk to you. We don't have a place for you, but let me suggest you talk to someone we use." So, because he used this recruiter to recruit executives for his company, the guy gave me a call, but basically to say, "No, I'm not gonna."
Okay. All right. So you tried that route and quickly realized that was not going to be the way to go.
Yeah, so it was just one-on-one. And, the good news is you only need one, right? So it's okay if 29 say no or whatever it was. You only need one to say yes.
And so you had the feedback from the recruiter, not the way to go. You were clearly focusing on biotech, so your industry of background and expertise and your specialization. You continued having discussions, and you started, I'm going to call it more of like a medium level to senior level in the organization to test it out. You got better at it. You refined the message. As you got that feedback, how did you take the next steps forward?
I just kept talking to everyone I could. So this is over a period of 4 to 6 months. And as I say, I did know roughly 30 people who were either on boards or were CEOs, so biotech CEOs who could introduce you to their board. I think it's important to say CEOs do not, or at least should not, select their own boards. Mm-hmm. But they are able to say to the chair of the nominating committee, hey, here's someone that you could take a look at. And so in the end, it was one of those that worked out. Now, the thing is, it's not like a job where there's always an opening, right? Sure. The company's only looking for a board member once in a while.
Right.
So that's why it wasn't so much that I networked to find new contacts. It's just that eventually one of the people I contacted, maybe it was more than 6 months actually, but within a year, called me and said, hey, actually our board is looking for a couple new board members. You still interested? And can I give your name and resume to the chair of the nominating committee of the board of the company where I am? And I said, sure.
That's what I've been working for. So do you believe that the way that we should think about this as a takeaway, it's almost you got to be top of mind for companies. So when the right opportunity opens up, you are the person that they're thinking of. Is that fair?
I think that's right. I think if you're sort of more than a few months out of date, you're not going to be top of mind. And so, reminding people you're still looking, especially if anyone's giving you any encouragement. So like I say, I did have a few who said, I think you'd be good at this, but, we're not looking for someone right now. That could be a polite way of turning you down. Mm-hmm. But I took it as an invitation to stay in touch with them. So eventually they'd either have to, say, okay, I'll put your name in, or else they'd have to say, look, this isn't really going to be a fit.
And
keep going until they say no.
That's right. I think there's an easy parallel here with just a normal job hunt. We don't talk about a board. If you found the companies that you really want to work for, how do you stay top of mind with them without annoying them? And some of the stuff that we've heard, and I'd love to hear how you did this, is maybe there's something in the news about their company or a competitor that you can write to them with a good excuse of saying, I was thinking of you because of this and this, so that they keep thinking of you. How did you go about staying top of mind with, say, the heads of nominating committees who you'd been in contact with?
Boy, those are great ideas, Alexander. I didn't think of those.
Well, I'd love to hear what you did then. I can take your ideas.
Because these were people I knew personally, not necessarily closely, but personally, I was just able to say, put in a phone call or send another email and say, hey, I'm still interested. Has anything come up, or can you give me any other ideas? I actually, come to think of it, I think I did use a little of the here's something I've learned, or I've refined my search a little bit, or but I didn't base it on news. That would have been a great idea.
And just take the flip side of that now, because on the company that you're with now, you are on the nominating and governance committee. Have you had people that have reached out and have tried to stay on your radar? And if so, what has or has not worked?
I have not had many try to stay on my radar. I think in 2005, in 14 years, I think only one or two people have contacted me. Maybe we're not a big enough company or high enough on the radar screen that people think of us first when they're looking for something.
Okay.
And I have to say, we're really rarely. We just haven't had a lot of turnover, so it would have been a very long process, and I don't know how effective it would have been staying in touch with me, to tell you the truth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember when we've talked about the story before, there's a key nugget to it that you just touched on very briefly here, and you've explained to me that you are probably not their normal, logical, magical fit. You had a different background experience. Because they had two seats that were open at one time, it was much easier for them to say, oh, maybe one of these could be a sort of a different type of candidate, could be a Will Messenger. Do you think that's fair? Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. So the person I had been in touch with who finally called me back and said, hey, I think we might have an opening. They were looking for two board members. So they had a couple people resign from the board, largely for geographic reasons, actually. People from abroad who just found the travel difficult. But because they had two openings, they were potentially Of course, they were looking for a biotech CEO.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we could think of someone else. And in particular, the business ethics aspect was what got them interested in me. So it wasn't the kind of personnel or even the strategy consulting. It wasn't that much my biotech background, because I wasn't in cancer discovery is what this company is, and I wasn't in cancer drug discovery. It was really the business ethics, and they felt like that's something that a company ought to have, and we have room to think about someone a little outside the box. Yeah.
And I find that so interesting, given the way we talked about your story in the beginning. That was almost the last arrow in your quiver about what you thought was going to be successful for you. And does that tell you anything that it's almost random, or you have to have so many different ways to tell your story? What is the sort of takeaway nugget you'd boil up from that?
Well, I guess one takeaway nugget is I was just really fortunate, and I think you have to allow for a certain amount of luck. Not if you're a biotech CEO. If you're a biotech CEO, call the recruiters. They'll call you back. But if you're a little bit of an oddball candidate, I think you have to be prepared that it might work or it might not, or it might come at random times. You have to be persistent. You do have to be able to shoot multiple arrows, as I did. Having the conversation, the coffee, where you say, just tell me about my strengths. Tell me about my weaknesses. And people are pretty clear about your weaknesses. You just don't look like the kind of people we usually see. But a strength is you have a diversity of experience that actually is meaningful. Business ethics actually is meaningful. So that gave me some encouragement. And I would say boards now are particularly looking for more diversity. Probably not probably not necessarily looking for people who've taught business ethics, but
Maybe they
for
should
other
be, given what we're
other
seeing in the
kinds of
markets
courses.
today.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. Yeah, but you don't usually think, well, we need a business ethics teacher on our board. We are looking for someone who's done business ethically and who can articulate what they think of as ethical business. That's certainly the case.
Well, given all of the scandals that we're seeing today, there's endless numbers. We could pick CBS, Uber, what have you. Do you feel like if you were starting your search today for the first time without this sort of background experience of having been on a board, do you think it would be easier? Would the pitch be the same as you did last time? How would you think about it today, given the way the world is?
Gosh, I haven't thought about starting over again. I think I'd go about it the same way. By talking to people who could potentially put me in touch with boards that are looking for someone. And so I guess for me it wasn't so much the experience that I brought. I think there are a lot of other people who are experienced, but it's being able to make the right kind of connection. I mean, in the sense of earning the confidence or the trust of someone who's in a position to vouch for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes from kind of a lifetime of, or at least part of a lifetime of, treating people well and doing good work with people. So I guess the best background is, work well.
And of course, being able to translate that across to an opportunity to show how it's a direct fit and in ways you didn't quite anticipate. So it worked out so well. And given that you have this experience now where you are a paid board director, you are a chair of one of the committees, if you were to go about your next search, let's say you said, you know what, I'd like to pick up a next one. Maybe I'd like to be on a public board, something like that. How would you do it differently this time?
I think I do have the experience now that I would talk to headhunters. I really do think service on a public company board is another sort of qualification for serving on a larger company board. And so I think to expand beyond my personal network, I would try to talk to recruiters. Absolutely.
And I would think today, I think you've got a great opportunity with the fact that you have that board experience plus your ethics background. I would think any company out there that we're seeing in the headlines that is struggling is probably going to have to make some changes. I would think it'd be logical that your candidacy would land up on their desk.
Yeah, maybe. I don't think I have time for another one now, but you kind of fired me up for, I should do that again. Yeah.
Well, let's put that into context as well for some of our listeners. Some people might not fully grasp the amount of time and effort it's required to put in there. Maybe you can speak to that. So you're on two of the committees, one of which you chair. You're also a member of the audit committee. Could you give us a sense of what it's like for you on a yearly basis, the number of hours, the frequency of meetings, those sorts of details?
I'm not sure I could really add up the hours. So the formal meetings are typically 5 or 6 board meetings a year, which are typically all day or sometimes 2 days, with usually the night before or the evening between the days as a board dinner, which is a very important part, I think, of board business is the social time together. Mm-hmm. And then each committee also meets 5 or 6 times a year. Those are usually by audio conference. So those don't require travel. So there's a few days there. And then we're often in touch with one another, either sometimes as by an informal conference or just a telephone call, or in touch with management, just getting updates. So there's unpredictable phone calls or emails, and then there's also reading material that comes from the company, mm-hmm. and trying to stay up with the field. So the rule it used to be that people would sit on lots of boards, but the rule of thumb now is 3 boards really. I mean we would certainly like to see people sitting on not more than 3 boards in terms of people who'd be candidate for our QL. And then that includes people who are not otherwise employed that doing boards, because there are a lot of retired biotech CEOs or sometimes medical officers who might be doing some consulting and some board work.
Mm-hmm.
If you're employed full time, I think one board is well. If you did more than one, it'd be certainly be taking away, in my opinion, from whatever your other work is, and I think that's not ideal.
The estimates that I've heard are 250 to 300 hours a year, perhaps, for a board role.
Yeah, I've never tried to add it up.
Would that be depressing?
No. I don't think so. I think you've got to be prepared. That's not that much time, right? There's 2,000 working hours in a year, so
right.
200 or 300 for a board. I don't think that's an underestimate at all. I think you better be prepared for that. If you're looking for a board seat, boards are not just rubber stamps anymore. There's real work to be done.
And I think it also depends the type of industry, and if you're doing M&As, it might be more of a feast or famine at times. It requires a lot of extra effort, or there might be times that there's a key management change, et cetera, or some people have resigned, running the management committee, the nominating committee. Now you've got a lot more work to do.
If you're the chair of the nominating committee, when you need to look for a new CEO, that is almost a full-time job. For a couple of months. Yeah, so it can be a lot more. And if your company is going through a crisis, whether it's a good crisis or a bad crisis, that's more time also.
And since you've been in this role now, I guess going on 14, 15 years, can you talk about the biggest surprise that you've had? What has occurred at being a board member that you didn't expect?
I'm not sure I expected it to be quite as enjoyable as it is. I think it's more enjoyable than strategy consulting. So I kind of thought of it as a kind of strategy consulting plus. I don't think I appreciated it's more than the intellectual challenge. For me, I think consulting was the intellectual challenge. It was just interesting. When you're on a board, it's more of an emotional. It's definitely more of an emotional ride, which I found enjoyable. There are great friendships with management and employees in the company. RQ is a fairly small company, and so I've gotten to know a lot of people throughout the company, and over time you see the progress that's made in a much longer way than you do in a consulting gig. It's just been a lot more enjoyable than I expected. And I guess maybe the more challenging thing I didn't expect was, how hard it is to serve in a senior position, but not try to manage it yourself. I think that's a transition that most board members find difficult, especially if they have been CEOs or otherwise senior executives. You're used to making a decision and then making it happen. And in a board, you're not there to sort of be alternate CEOs. You've chosen a CEO as a board, and you're responsible for evaluating him or her and holding his or her feet to the fire, so to speak. But that's not at all the same as sort of being like a shadow a management committee. And that's tough to figure out is what's the right way to be engaged, but not try to tell people what to do.
It's been described to me as noses in, fingers out, which is a big transition for a lot of people who've been executives.
Yes, that's a great way to describe it. Noses in, fingers out, and that's another thing. I also think of trust but verify. The old military analogy. So it's really important to trust the executives. And I think a thing that will cause a company to fall apart faster than anything else is if the board does not trust the CEO or the senior executives. It's hard for me to imagine how a company could really run without a level of trust. But that doesn't mean that you don't also need to see it yourself, and getting access to the data of the company and not just to reports that have only been prepared for the board. Being able to talk to people in the company other than in the C-suite A good board is able to do that, and it doesn't threaten anyone because there's a level of trust underneath. And so getting the nose in, it just seems a natural part of a good board relationship. But it takes time to develop that trust.
And Will, for you, the board role, while a fascinating and great and fulfilling role, is just a part-time job. And it's what you fill around what you do during the majority of the day. And you talked about it before. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of that and then how you balance between the two?
So I'm leading an organization called Theology of Work project, which is an independent nonprofit entity that's devoted to applying the scripture and Christian faith in general to all kinds of work. So we're asking, how does the Bible and Christian faith help you go about your work? So it's business ethics is a big part of that. So it's kind of an outgrowth of my work in business ethics, and I'm the executive editor and also the CEO. So I'll certainly say that I have a board myself, of course, and they do unto me as the board I'm on, does unto our CEO. It's great.
And Andy Mills is a fantastic source of information, but I'm sure also requires your expertise and your best every day.
Yeah, and as a board member, I think about Andy because Andy's a terrific board member, and he's also co-chair of the board of Theology of Work project. So the way he and the Theology of Work project board work with me, I think is fantastic. I think they're very supportive, and the things I was just talking about in management and board relationships, Andy's great at guiding our board to do that with me. So that's a real model for me as I try to be a board member, elsewhere, and vice versa. I've certainly learned from being a board member what it is that the CEO needs to do to keep the board informed, to build that level of trust, to make sure that they have the information they need. I think as a board member, you got to make decisions based on a limited amount of information. You're not there every day, in the trenches. And so you're always asking, do I have the information I need? And learning from what it means to be a board member in terms of information flow has really helped me as a CEO to try to keep my board informed of the kind of things I think they'll want to know.
I'm thinking of a parallel. So Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I remember him explaining, his analyst was explaining when when Colin Powell hired his analyst, he said, here's what you tell me. Here's 3 things. And this is the order you tell me in. Tell me what you know, then tell me what you don't know, and only then do you tell me what you think. Is that an interesting parallel to what you're talking about?
I think it is an interesting parallel. I don't know that it has to be in that order. I might say, tell me what you think first, so I know what the stakes are. I know what we're trying to get at. But then tell me what you know, and tell me what you don't know. The other thing that I think builds trust fastest is when an executive or a CEO tells you what the potential bad news is long before it occurs. And as a manager, I have an instinct to say, well, maybe this will all blow over, maybe things will be fine, let's deal with it when we come to it. But I know as a board member, having the CEO or in the presentation say, a risk we may face 6 months from now, or a problem that could come up that we're not yet sure how to handle is this. Mm-hmm. Do you have any ideas, or do you have any help, anything to offer? But more importantly, just to let us know. And the upside of that is, well, it builds trust, as I say. And the other upside is, if something does go wrong, if it does come to pass, you've told us that in advance, so we're not surprised. There's no longer any question of, why didn't we see this coming, or how could you do this to us? We're well informed, and we've probably been part of the risk management that's occurred between when you first told us and when whatever happens might occur. So you've got your board working with you, from the beginning.
Well, Will, I feel like we have covered so much today, and I wonder if we could sort of summarize it up. If you have any parting advice for new and aspiring board members that are listening.
Yeah, I think persistence really is the key. It's even compared to a job, it's one where there just has to be the right match at the right time. And the fact that you weren't the right match at the right time for a company A, today, that doesn't mean that a company very much like company A tomorrow or 3 months from now, might not be the right match.
It only takes one, I believe you said once or twice on the show, right?
That's right. Only one.
Well, Will, thank you so much for being a part of the Boardroom Bound podcast today. What is the best way for our audience to contact you if they wanted to follow up?
Probably the easiest way is to go to theologyofwork.org, or just Google Theology of Work. That's the name of our organization. And there's a Contact Us page there. And if you were to send me a message via the contact page, it will definitely get to me.
Great. Well, Will, we were delighted to have you on the show today. And thank you so much for sharing your insights and helping all of us be more boardroom bound.
Thanks. Great to talk with you, Alexander.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Will Messenger and appreciated his vulnerability and authenticity about his board search, the failures initially that started out, how he had to pivot from that to become successful. And I love the idea that you might finally make some breakthrough of companies that are interested in you, but the timing might not be right. Board seats don't turn over every day. It might be years before they turn over. So then how do you stay on the radars? You've worked so hard to find companies where you could be a fit, and you can't leave that lying there. It's in some ways like a job that you're really excited about. You've got to find that careful balance of making sure you stay in touch and stay on their radar. Now remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu where you can get links to everything we talked about today. And if you enjoyed this episode, I'd ask that you take 30 seconds to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews on iTunes are one of the best ways to get out word about this podcast. So thanks for joining me on this episode of the show. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be boardroom bound.